What should we do? We should ask, is it true? We should do a lot more of that in sociology, and we do it. But what I find really exciting is this new movement of research transparency, reproducibility, and replicability is giving us a new set of tools to, help us answer this question, help others answer this question in a yet more rigorous way than we have done before.
Felix, welcome to this show, The Journeys of Scholars.
Glad to be here, Ada.
Thank you very much for being with us. So The Journeys of Scholars is a podcast about deciphering excellence in the journey itself. So while academia is a perfect place to sharpen our research abilities towards driving towards excellence, it tends to be less helpful about the mentoring aspect, the managing, arranging the wider context of how these abilities are supposed to grow. So this conversation is going to be about your journey in particular and how you have arranged these things and how you are managing sort of your time from a macro strategy perspective, but also in terms of a micro strategy. So Felix Elwert, you are the professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You hold a graduate degree in sociology and in statistics from Harvard University. You're also the editor-in-chief since 2021 for the Sociological Methods and Research Journal. You took over the role after Chris Winship, who actually also has been on the show previously. And you're also the associate editor of the Journal of Causal Inference. Your research and teaching is closely linked to the core themes of causal inference, social demography, and social inequality. And more specifically, your research is focused on four main areas: social networks and family determinants of health outcomes, mortality, neighborhood effects, and obviously methods for causal inference. And so your work has appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Public Health, Demography, and elsewhere. You have, and as your research really testifies, received numerous awards in 3 disciplines: sociology, demography, and statistics. You won the first Causality in Statistics Education Award from the American Statistical Association, European Population Association. You've also received the award from there. You won 2018 the Leo Goodman Award from the American Sociological Association. And so it hit me, Felix, in terms of your journey as a scholar. On the one hand, we have the highly sort of fractalization of sociology, and to some extent, I would say, social science as well, into smaller schools, trains of sort of thoughts of schools and theories and subfields. And so you have, in this fractalization, it's really relatively hard to sort of bring causal inference into the forefront. But you, on the other hand, have a sort of a great example of a sociologist that has not been limited by this resistance to thinking a bit more scientifically about these questions. So really, how have you been able to manage to get, this wide disciplinary background of yours and still maintain and been very successful in getting the causal inference fields into the forefront?
I don't think it wasn't that difficult, really, because I don't see the field like you do in your premise. While it's true that sociology is to a degree factionalized, and of course, maybe that's just a synonym for saying that we're multiple disciplines in one, so there are disciplinary differences. I actually think that thinking causally is an easy game in the social sciences, because most social scientists, to one degree or another, do think causally. Now here, I don't think that thinking causally is to think scientifically versus thinking non-causally is thinking non-scientifically. That's really not the case. Science pursues different types of claims, broadly descriptive, predictive, and causal. And what this new literature on causal inference is doing, and what our work, my work, and much more importantly, the work of others is doing, is to point out exactly where we are implicitly thinking causally, and then we bring this new machinery to bear to provide structure, to provide insights and opportunities to do this work in a more rigorous manner. So I really see this as a much more of a unifying agenda than one that sort of has to struggle against silos and
Right. How interesting. So one thing that if you think about, for example, in epidemiology and also to large extent, demography, where there has been an emphasis on associations and associational studies, where especially in the social sciences and health sciences in general, because complex systems are complex, there's sort of a sentiment that it's futile to some extent to think, or at least even aspire towards identifying causal effects or causal relationships. And so how have you, but I think you have still managed to sort of, even if you're maybe you have been situated in a network of people that in the beginning sort of already thought causally, but what would you say to an individual that their supervisors or their mentors are really situated in this sort of thinking that has been, at least, I think the causal inference is really getting traction, but it's still sort of stuck a little bit in these associational thinking. How should they navigate this?
Yeah. How should they do this? I think that the key is to realize that we think causally all the time, that causal thinking really isn't a big deal. Every time we ask what if question, or what would happen if, or every time we care about policy, really we are interested in causal questions. We're wondering what would happen if I did this rather than that in order to make the world a better place. Every time we're thinking about mechanisms, as sociologists in Sweden famously started doing much earlier than others. Every time we think mechanistically, we think causally, because we're trying to figure out what makes stuff happen.
Sure.
Now, one of the issues I think for beginners is that our discipline, just as much as other disciplines, is sort of still afraid of a discourse that was really rampant in the 70s and 80s, where methodologists walked around and told people that they can't talk about causation because we don't know what that is.
Exactly.
So as a field, as fields, we've developed weasel words and gang signs to hide our true intentions from the world. We started to talk about effects, but said, "Oh, but we don't mean this to be causal."
Exactly.
We started talking about impacts. My new favorite phrase is that we talk about how social facts shape outcomes. I'm like, wow, that's so artistic. That's really wonderful. Sort of bringing in the humanistic side of the social sciences, but really, that's just, that's just imprecise language for saying we want to know what would happen if we did A rather than B. We're talking about causal effects. Other disciplines have been very clear about this. For example, there was an editorial written by the great Miguel Hernan in the Journal of Epidemiology a few years back, when Miguel Hernan was the editor, and he had this catalog of synonyms for causal effect, and he just boldly declared that from now on he's going to treat all of these words as synonyms for causal effect, and every time somebody thus talks about a causal effect, that there's certain standards that need to be brought to bear, certain assumptions that need to be explicated, to make sure that the audience isn't hoodwinked into accepting causal claims without the proofs that are, or rather the standards that are required to make such statements credible. I thought that was enormously healthy for epidemiology, and certain quarters of sociology are also trying to drive this home in sociology. And to an extent, I think, science is a big institution. Institutions move slowly, but I think there's clear progress and a sense of liberation. Because we're recognizing that, we're not trying to do all these million different things. We just have lots of synonyms for trying to do maybe 3 or 4 things. And recognizing these similarities helps us to cut through the thicket of notation, through the thicket of terminology, and come up with really clear guidelines for how to do whichever one of these 3, 4, 5 things we're trying to do well.
I think that's a hugely sort of facilitator for the thinking, like in terms of, explain variance as another way to try to bucket in what we're doing, not in a causal term, but in sort of a more statistical term and so on. But Felix, so if you think about your journey, like into causal inference, and before that, you graduated. You have a master's, as far as I'm gathering from your CV, from the New School for Social Research. I think you started off at the Free University of Berlin, even before that. And this is 1997, 1999, approximately there. So what like were you already thinking in terms of this language of causality, or were you influenced by the 1970s sentiment, or how did you get into this? And if you go back in time and take us through your journey.
Yeah, so I was exposed to explicitly causal thinking fairly late, actually, or knowingly exposed to it fairly late. But of course, given what I've just said, I need to qualify that, because my claim was that we as a discipline have been thinking causally for a very long time, though we may not have known it. And that's exactly what happened in my training. I started out, I was a double major in sociology and economics. And in economics, any type of mechanistic thinking, any type of microeconomic model is structural, which is the economics a weasel word for causal. And I remember very clearly in my first or second course in microeconomics being really blown away by the power of these if-then statements, causal if-then statements. If you do this, then this will happen. If by contrast you do that, then something else will happen. I didn't see so much of that in sociology, but of course it was there when, even when you read the classics. I can't go back to Weber's Economy and Society, the famous second chapter with all the definitions, and look at how Weber tries to grapple with the notion of an explanatory sociology and not see causal ambition there.
Right.
It's very clear that there's causal ambitions in other leading early thinkers have thought in this way too. But explicitly, I didn't come across it until I was interviewing for graduate school, when I switched after doing a master's at the New School for Social Research. I went to do a Ph.D. elsewhere, and it was really like an epiphany. I had, as you mentioned, I ended up getting my PhD at Harvard, but I can tell you, I had no plans of going to Harvard. I was a European graduate student. I was absolutely certain that if I were to stay in the US, it would be a dream to study at Stanford or at Columbia. So I applied at these places and I got in, and it was all very nice and very cordial. Though, coming from a sort of European background where you're constantly told that, no, this is not going to work. I was slightly confused by the sort of red carpet reception that prospective graduate students got, and I sort of didn't trust it. And then, but I was European, as I mentioned. I figured, well, if I'm applying to Columbia and Stanford, I might as well spend another $50 and apply to Harvard.
Right.
I had no idea, by the way, about what was going on.
You applied for all three and beyond as well.
Yeah, exactly. I did this. No, I didn't get into my safety, actually. And what a delight that was. So then I roll into meeting with faculty at Harvard, and I had no idea who I was talking about, which is a good thing. I would have been petrified with if I had. And then I meet Chris Winship, who does two things that were really transformative to me. I said, I told him, like, my plan was to become a mathematical sociologist. Of course, I had no idea what that actually meant. And the first thing that Chris did that really impressed me was he said, I can do that. You can study with me, but you're going to be unemployed.
Afterwards.
Yes. And so, after this red carpet treatment elsewhere, I thought, this guy's taking me seriously. So I really liked that. And then he gave me this paper that was going to come out that he'd written with this graduate student of his, the now famous Steve Morgan, on the 1999 Annual Review of Sociology piece on causal inference, which was sort of the first impactful survey of causal inference, which later became their blockbuster.
Exactly.
So I read this paper on the flight back, and I realized this is exactly how I was meant to think for a long time. It was like a homecoming. So I signed up, and then, as these things do, choices self-justify.
Yeah.
I'm very happy I did it that way.
That's really an amazing story. It's an amazing story. So okay, so that now I start to see the movements into the field of causal inference, and which later also became sort of your main work that you've been able to get into these other disciplinary sort of substantive fields. And so, okay, so you were admitted to Harvard, and you probably never thought about anything else than causal inference during that time. But what was the during your time with Chris and other scholars at Harvard, how was that change? Was there any sort of, I assume it was gradual, but was there any sort of mental resistance to these thoughts? Were they, fitting perfectly, or was there, how? Tell us a little bit more about your deep dive into the field of causal.
Well, the reasoning fit perfectly. The technical apparatus, of course, still became very challenging, and I had to remediate lots of holes in my prior training, as I think anybody experiences in graduate school. This was nothing sort of special in that regard. But let me put it this way. So as an undergraduate, and while I was studying in Berlin, I'd taken a course on the philosophical basics of statistical reasoning. Because that course sounded really interesting, and I'd just taken my first course in statistics, and I thought this was a completely different way of thinking, a helpful way of thinking. But of course, I was swimming, and like not knowing where the shore was. So I took that course, and it was really illuminating to me, because the whole point of the course was to take what struck me as extraordinarily convoluted thinking, like likelihoods and bizarre stuff like that, confidence intervals, and sort of went back to work that was mostly done in the 20s and 50s by analytic philosophers, whose game, I figured out, was basically trying to simplify, and based on the premise that everything that can be said clearly. Is Wittgenstein's famous dictum. That really resonated with me. And so with causality, what fits so easily was that I think the the potential outcomes framework is sort of like the cliff notes to a thousands-year-old literature. It's the cliff notes because it says, look, a causal effect is just the difference between two potential outcomes. It's the difference what would happen if you did A versus what would happen if you did B.
Yeah.
And that's it. And then there's a little bit of notation. You got to pay attention to that one subscript. It's liberating.
Yeah.
And that, it simplified. It took something that seemed so hard and made it obvious and intuitive. So that was great. I think I forget the rest of your question.
No, I mean, I think that the essence of my question is the following: is that if you have, I mean, this is very much the training that I went through, which is this continental, sociological, more philosophically oriented. You read Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and then you spend another couple of years reading them and some continuation of that literature. It's a very different tradition that you can grow into compared to the tradition of American sociology that tends to be a little bit more analytical. So in terms of you had economics already that sort of helped you maybe to think in terms of these more formalistic analytical logic that causal inference allows. But basically that friction, that if there was any friction, of moving from that continental thinking into the more analytical thinking.
Again, no, not really. I mean, I did do a master's at the New School for Social Research, a place that it can be accused of many things except for being a hothouse of quantitative research.
Yeah.
And so, the sociology side of my training in Europe, which really was just a few semesters, was of course an equal appreciation for conceptual clarity. And I think, it'd be a crime to neglect that you need, you need more than methods to do a science, to do discipline.
Yeah.
We've already talked about theory, but you also need conceptual apparatus that's solid and well thought out. That really important work has nothing to do with, or has very little to do with causal inference, I think. And so instead of sort of feeling a friction there, I thought it was empowering. I've mentioned this course in the philosophical foundations of statistical reasoning that I took as an undergrad. Yeah, sure, I did that, but I also took a course on the positivism debate in German sociology. When was this? In the 60s? This is Adorno and Habermas.
Yeah.
Fighting with Albers and Popper.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that the instructor of that course, from whom I learned a lot, it's fair to say her sympathies did not lie with Popper, and I thought that was just really enriching. Not what I do now.
Yeah. And so during your graduate studies, you also took a master's in statistics, right, Felix? So what was the reasoning there? Like, sociology is naturally not so statistically oriented. Chris Winship is probably one of the stronger, give you the stronger training in terms of causality and perhaps some statistics. But what was the reason to also grab a master's in statistics whilst you going here?
It was Winship who suggested that I did this, but the social story of this is that Winship never told you that you must do anything. Like any conversation with Winship is always sort of jokey and is just sort of sounding out the depth of one's commitment, of one's interests and stuff. Winship in one of these moments just said, if you really want to do that, then you should probably take a little more statistics. Pointed me to the first course in the stat sequence. I took that. I liked it. I said, oh, if you like this, you should take another course. And of course, then I did. They said the goal should be you should take Don Rubin's seminar on causal inference. But before I could take that, I had to take another course. One thing gave the other, and it's funny, right? So sociologists, are very aware that their discipline is, you said factionalized. I think I would say sort of really pluralistic. But what many sociologists don't realize is that the same is true of statistics. Now, of course, statistics has a core, right? There's certain tools that you need to know. You have to go through probability. You have to go through inference. There are mathematical tools that you can't do without. But then there are so many different flavors that, depending on what master's program you're in, you'd learn a completely different type of statistics.
That's really interesting.
And the one at Harvard the master's program was structured in a way so that you could really take a lot of courses on causal inference. So that's what I did.
One of the few places, I should say, in a statistical department that provides causal inference courses, as far as I understand, at least at that time. Now things have changed.
Back then. Today that's different. Right now there are multiple powerhouses. There's Penn, there's Johns Hopkins, Berkeley. There are plenty of places.
Now it's mushrooming everywhere.
I mean, since I arrived, when I arrived, there was hardly any causal inference going on at Wisconsin, and now there's a group of junior mid-career statisticians of causal inference who do just spectacularly great work. It's been like 10 years that department changed too.
So in terms of skills, Felix, so if you think about, you had some economics under your belt, and that gives you relatively good training and manipulating formulas and just your mathematical skills. As a sociology graduate student at that time, did you feel that you had most of the mathematical skills that you needed? Was it hard to keep up? Did you have to spend the extra hours to do that more than compared to stats students? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Of course I had to do more, but that's always true. I found myself in the first course on probability, and I realized I was one of 3 graduate students in a sea of over 100 computer science and applied math and statistics majors who took that course because they needed an easy A. This is not an easy course.
That's so funny. So how did you handle that? time-wise, already doing a degree at Harvard is very demanding, but you found the hours. Like, just walk us through a normal day at that time when you were doing those courses.
I worked hard, and in the beginning, this was now 20 years ago, right, when I started. And in our graduate student orientation, one of the faculty just sort of stood in front of the small windowless room, in which we're all sitting, we're all thinking we're the one admissions mistake. And we are aware that we have to work hard. And then, one of the faculty said that, guys, like 40 hours a week's not going to cut it. You'll likely find yourself studying maybe 60 hours or so. And I realized now I think this would be basically impossible. There'd be an insurrection, but what do I know, right? Maybe I'm just roseating the past. But I was sitting there and thinking, wow, I don't think I can do that. But we did all work extremely hard. I didn't travel to the town of Boston for the entire semester, even though that's just like 2 or 3 subway stops away.
Exactly.
I was completely burned out at the semester.
Most of the good food is there as well.
As I found out, yes. Although, no, that was like nearing burnout. So I don't recommend that. But what did I do? I took my first semester. I took Chris Winship's famous course 203A, which was a survey. Regression, and it was just mind-blowing, in a course that was really easy to sink 20 hours into. it was also fun doing that. And Chris had given me like two really old books, like 3 computer books on linear algebra for social scientists, and Hanishek and Jackson's regression book, which is pretty great because they didn't have computers, so they had to actually go through the math and tell you the intuition. These are not necessarily books that I would recommend today. That's sort of how I did the remedial thing, calculus, and then faked it.
And so with all that stats and the mentorship from Chris and so on, you are at the trajectory where you could go fully become a methodologist versus become more of a substantive researcher. And I believe gathering from your publication trajectory is somewhere in the middle. But there are so walk us through if that's correct, if you are somewhere in the middle and versus, but also maybe adding to that question, like were you thinking about becoming purely a methodologist at that point?
Well, so there are lots of different ways of being a methodologist, and I'm grateful that this was pointed out to me early on. What I am not is a statistician, and while I greatly admire those who are statisticians, I didn't aspire to become one because I didn't think I could be. And I wanted to be, and I want to be, and I think I am a social scientist. But as you say, there are different flavors. There certainly are social science statisticians, especially if you look at certain flavors of econometrics. They're doing math. They're doing probability. They're doing statistics.
Theorem proving and stuff like that.
There's a really important place for that. Same is true in psychometrics and to a limited degree in sociology. And that's great. And then you move away from that until you're an ambitious social scientist to try to keep up with a sort of reasonably keep up with the frontier of statistical research. And what I like to do is I like to see myself sort of in the translation stage. And I really need to emphasize that this is a personal preference. It's not that I think this is the most important work, though, self-justification around a mock, I could try to do that. Just enjoy doing, and what I've been fortunate enough to find that others see some value in it, right? But here's the reason why we need this translation work. Statisticians have other quality criteria than social scientists. So broadly speaking, if a statistician develops a new estimator, the most important thing for them to get that thing published, this new estimator, is to document that it is unbiased, consistent, and that maybe it has some efficiency advantages in certain situations. And these claims then need to be proved according to the standards of the field. That's great. Now, to a social scientist, the first question when they're faced with a new estimator is not, is it unbiased, consistent, and efficient in some sense? The real first question is, does this estimator actually answer the question that I mean to pose? That's a completely different question, right? The statistician just knows what class of problems they're addressing. They're expressing it as succinctly and formally as possible because, they have this aesthetic value of brevity. But for a social scientist, it's often completely intransparent whether this particular estimator actually deals with the question that you need to ask.
I think that's please go ahead, Felix.
So I think this has been the claim about one of the benefits of the so-called causal revolution for a long time, is that it's made it so clear what type of question we're dealing with. And now, 1 or 2 years ago, a team of authors led by Ian Lundberg wrote this wonderful paper in the American Sociological Review called "What is Your Estimand?" Which really is just fancy talk for saying, what is your question? And they lead us through, by way of really trenchant and insightful examples, lead us through the exercise of moving from a sociological question to an estimator. It's really one of my currently favorite papers. Right? So this is the kind of methodology that I really think is extremely important, and to me personally is fun as well. They're not developing a new estimator, they're just showing social scientists how to decide whether a particular estimator is actually the one they want.
That's I think that's a terrific summary of being a translator. I was going to ask you, what is definition of a translator, but I think you've already answered that question. Had to think about that middle ground of translating, whether it's a computer science method or whether it's a causal inference method, whether it's an estimator, where it's a measurement tool. Do you have a certain, and this is for those particular people in the audience that will be watching this, that's a sort of formula to think about, like a checklist maybe instead of a formula, like you had to think about to become a better translator, had to sharpen those skills?
Yeah, let's try. I want to point out that what your question implies something really important, namely that this translation work is not just done by methodologists, but it's done by anybody who's doing empirical research, quantitative or qualitative, right? We sit there, we have a question, and we got to figure out what are the appropriate tools for answering the question that we have posed. And so I can't do this globally. Sure. But in a nutshell, I think we start with a question. We want to reduce it to a type of structure that seems familiar. For example, if I'm interested in the question, what's the role of eviction in producing poverty or in perpetuating poverty? Okay, great. That's a pertinent, timely, really important, clearly sociological question, famously, obviously posed by Matt Desmond in his wonderful book, a qualitative book, mind you, but it's a causal question. So we start with, what's the role of eviction in perpetuating poverty? Well, first we got to analyze that sentence and figure out what do we mean by role, right? Role is one of these weasel words that could mean a million different things. But when we talk about the perpetuation of poverty, we mean that we're clearly interested in the agentic role, in the production of poverty through eviction. And then suddenly we're realizing, okay, so that smells causal. Now, given that this now really sounds causal, what is the structure of a causal question? The next step is to figure out the counterfactual. The structure of a causal question is to say we have a difference between potential outcomes. What would happen if eviction happened versus what would happen if, what is my counterfactual? Is it to stay living there? Is it to move to? It's hard. But once we figured out what the counterfactual is, we can say, great. Now we have the structure. We can use all the estimators that are available to us for causal inference. But estimators have to make different demands on data. Some say, hey, just run a randomized experiment because that's the gold standard. And you're like, can't randomize people to lose their home. That's not ethical. Can't do this. Okay, great. What's the second best? Okay, some quasi-experimental thing. Maybe we have some randomness in the decision of eviction courts. Get access to that. That's super. Right? So now the structure of the estimator, the structure of the data compels us to think in certain ways, to explore new avenues. We have some quasi-random assignment.
Mm.
Maybe there is this quasi-random assignment of eviction in the housing courts.
Mm.
We can't get access to these data.
Mm.
Maybe it's because, we're an underfunded graduate student, or maybe it's because these data are actually confidential and it's hard to get to in the span of a PhD course of a PhD. So now we're doing observational data analysis. Now we realize, we have to make more assumptions now, because the easy route of running a randomized experiment, I put easy here in scare quotes, it's not available. So now we've got to understand the assumptions that need to be licensed. And what are assumptions? Assumptions are claims about reality.
Exactly.
So now, we turn to our statistician and we say, hey, can I assume this? And the statistician says, brother, you're on your own. I prove the properties of this estimator under the assumption that the assumptions are true. But whether the assumptions are true, that's on you, the social scientist, justify. And then we're really happy because there's a place for us, a really critical, unavoidable place for real deep social science, subject matter knowledge, and curiosity about the lived world. That is just essential in this research process.
And this basically means that the translator here would sit between, I would assume, between the statistician, like the models being developed, maybe talking to the statistician, reading the papers, understanding, some or, great part of it, but not necessarily, having the full skills to write an own estimator, but also the substantive researcher, right? Which has, say the poverty researcher or the neighborhood guy. So sitting between them, right? It's basically knowing enough about both so that you can convey the insights.
That's right. And some disciplines have even differentiated to a degree that's a known slot. If you think about epidemiology, again, I'm going to simplify here, but epidemiologists are not medical doctors. By and large, they're not biostatisticians or statisticians either. They're the people who can talk to both. Many of the great programs in epidemiology have a lot of statistical training, have a lot of biomedical training in order to facilitate that. In sociology, we don't have that role institutionalized because I think to an extent, we're still a little bit stuck in the mold of the 19th century scientist, the lone wolf who does it all, has the question, collects the data, analyzes them, and puts them in verse form. There's some of that. In other sciences, there's much more collaboration, hence differentiation. And so, no, we just haven't institutionalized that.
But do you think there's this actually critical question here, which is that, in economics, we have like econometricians, and in epidemiology, medicine, we have biostatisticians that, to some extent have perhaps much more training than a translator in sociology would have. So we see them develop some estimators. We see them, do proving some theorems and so on. Whereas a translator, as far as I'm gathering from our conversation, is not really expected to do that, right? But do you think we need that in sociology? And in political science, perhaps we're getting a little bit more of that. Sorry, please go ahead.
No, it depends. I mean, you look around at the hundreds of departments of sociology, and you recognize many don't have anybody who's identified as a methodologist. I think that's worrisome for sure. Among the most research active departments, you do have methodologists who do that sort of stuff. That's one way of addressing your question. The other is to sort of point out, perhaps at this juncture in the interview, there are plenty of people in sociology who develop new things and prove theorems.
Exactly.
I've occasionally done that too. But so, if I think, I think about some, sort of young and mid-career methodologists in sociology, they do plenty of that. Think of young Joe at Harvard, Jeff Woodke at
University of Chicago.
They're sociologists. They're also methodologists who do translation, but they're also methodologists who develop new tools and prove things about
this. They have gone one step further than it just being a translator. They are actually, developing things.
Yeah, and again, I think your question sort of implies sort of a prestige ranking, and I want to push back against that. I think sort of suppose you have a big, you have a project in which you have, say, a sociological theorist and a professor of statistics from a stats department, and you have a sociological methodologist who talks between them. They're all needed for this project. There is no hierarchy.
No, definitely not. And I think one thing that to emphasize, I think that's very good that you're saying that, because the translator's work is actually, to some extent, even more of a hard work, because they often require to have to know across a broad sense of different, workings and assumptions.
Maybe, but again, I don't think that like everything that can be done well. And can be pushed to a level of expertise. And so I don't think these different skills that need to be brought to a successful collaborative work are any, like, they should all be done to the maximum of rigor, and that's going to be hard. No, I really don't think that one is sort of intrinsically harder than the other. There's certain things that are difficult for this person and easy for that person.
Good point. Yeah.
But the tools themselves should be done well.
I think that's a great point, and that brings me to the question of developing or fostering mastery in one's whatever trajectory one chooses. And this is now a bit more broader, but I think we can take causal inference as an example, but I'm thinking about this question in a broader sense of how to start pushing yourself, your team, and your collaborators to a level of thinking in terms of mastery. In general, what's your sort of thinking about that, your recipe, or the way that you tend to foster this among your students, your collaborators, and so on?
That's a really important question, and I wish I had a good answer to that. As junior faculty, I think I made the mistake that fortunately only few junior faculty make. I assumed that these bright interested students are just like me, and of course they weren't, because we're individuals. So with every student that I work with, I sort of have to rediscover or discover a new way of figuring out what they want and what's best for them. And to me, this is always a dialogue. And I should say I don't run a lab, because there are different styles of being a professor and a mentor. Mine is that I don't usually run a lab. I work one-on-one with students. And I work with students who want to do, causal inference methodology, and I work with students who really don't, who want to be, stratification researchers or sociologists of the family. And I'm delighted to work with all of them as soon as it becomes clear that they have the ambition of asking, hard questions and sort of challenging, the received wisdom, or confirming the received wisdom in a novel and important way. So I don't have a recipe, Adele.
Mm, mm,
Some students have to suggest it would be really useful to take this course.
mm, mm.
Other students want to take so many stats courses that I have to sort of say, look, like, I also have to be a sociologist.
Mm, mm.
But there's one thing that occurs to me now that I do have. There's one rule, and that is that I basically don't become a primary advisor to somebody who hasn't taken the required sociological theory course yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So that's theory. That's one condition here.
I think, if you want to be a sociologist, and being in a sociology program indicates that you do, you have to show some commitment to speaking to all sociologists. And we don't have one lingua franca in sociology. A familiarity with the broad theoretical questions of the discipline, I think, is absolutely essential. If I find myself in a program and I discover, I don't want to do theory and I don't want to take this course in stratification, I don't care about family sociology and demography bores me to pieces, then I need to change to a different PhD program.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And but this is fine, right? People enter PhD programs at a young age. And I think a good PhD program allows students, a good PhD program forces students to do certain things that you have to do as a sociologist. Thus gives them the opportunity to figure out if they really want to be part of that discipline. But then a good program also has a culture that allows students to figure out that they don't want to do that and switch programs, do something else, or tailor the program to fit their needs if those needs are still fitting within the discipline of sociology.
That's really good advice in terms of how, as a graduate student, to think about your own journey and in relationship to your mentor's journey. In this case, and so how do you? And you say you don't have a lab, but you have, I assume, plenty of students that you're working with and collaborators, obviously, that you're working with, and there's another aspect of this, is that you, from your level of seniority experience, you see certain questions, combination of questions, and you have, I assume, much more interesting questions that you would like to explore, both in the translation field of causal inference and the substantive field. How do you manage that? Do you try to lead, still your own papers, or you try to present them to your students or collaborators? So how do you handle the flora of ideas? Because asking the right question is also a path to mastery here, right? Working on certain questions that might be unfavorable from the domain knowledge or from the domain where to stand. So how do you work on that?
I think the answer is very different if you're talking to faculty, if you're talking to a graduate student. You're like, we read the journals, we read the newspaper, we talk to our friends, and we become interested in things. And there are too many good questions than a person can answer in their career, so we got to be selective. There are different models for that. In my own career, I've been sort of very ecumenical in the topics that I've addressed. I've done work on the causal effect of widowhood and mortality, done work on neighborhood effects, and these days I do a lot on peer effects in education. Completely disparate areas. As faculty, it's kind of okay to do that because we can get ourselves collaborators. But when I talk to graduate students, I try to make it very clear that every time you touch a new subject area, you need to do a new dissertation, right? Because there's a literature, there's a depth on any question, there are research traditions, and you need to be familiar with them.
Yeah.
So, to write three paper dissertation in 3 different substantive areas is extremely hard, and I usually discourage that. Because I prefer if students write 1 dissertation rather than 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so what are the two goals? The two avenues are find yourself a collaborator or develop the expertise on your own. Realize that this is going to be extremely time consuming, right?
Yeah.
Say that learning a new data set takes about 6 weeks. How much longer does it take to just sort of casually stroll over into a new subfield and then read the last 40 years of the work? It's
So selectiveness is one key, but also finding yourself collaborators that you tend to, and you have looking at your publication stream, you have a wide set of collaborators across fields. And this brings me to another theme, which is collaboration in general. And this is a question about when to go solo, which is something generally encouraged in say economics, sociology, and to some extent political science, but maybe less so nowadays. And versus when to go in collaboration mode, and what we see, for example, in epidemiology with longer authorship lists. So how do you reflect on that choice?
It's tricky, and I don't have a great answer. I find that sort of looking at friends and colleagues, to an extent, it's a personality question. There are some people who really like working alone. I happen to really enjoy working in collaborative teams. And so, I often work on topics that, or projects that lend themselves to collaboration. But there are plenty of, I think that's the key thing. Speed also matters. Right. So if you're in a grant-driven environment and you work more with medical folks, as I do some, things need to happen because the paper needs to be there in 2 years.
Yeah.
Maybe you're able to write the same paper, but it's going to take you 5. Okay, great. It's impossible.
Yeah.
I think there's great value at the beginning of one's career to try to see a project through from beginning to end, the question, analysis, and the write-up, especially the write-up. Later on, it's clearly less essential.
Yeah, the writing phase is obviously one thing that I'm happy to talk a little bit more about in a minute. But before we move on to that question, is this exact thing that I believe many of us do face as human beings in any domain, which is this difference. I tend to ask this question to my to the people appearing in the show. So Adam Grant wrote this book about give and take, which sort of depicts a little bit ideal type buckets of personalities, where you have the givers and the takers and the matchers. And so people, the giving bucket, they tend to give more than they take, and then the matchers, they tend to basically match on you gave me X, I give you X, whereas the takers are those that tend to take a little bit more in terms of human exchange. And this is really something you see in any domain, right? In marriage and relationship, friendship, work in general. How do you handle this 3 different personality types in collaboration, and also that this, I believe, also is something that changes over time and depending on which discipline and so on that you find yourself in?
So I don't know the book, and I don't have a good answer to that. I know there are some people who have the same role in the various projects that they have. I think in the collaborative projects that I've been engaged with, I've assumed different roles. Some of these roles I liked more than others.
Yeah.
Right. I don't have a good answer.
I mean, it is a hard question because you have, you have also throughout your career that as a PhD student, for example, you tend to do, the bulk of the work. I mean, that's sort of it's your thesis, but oftentimes the mentors or the collaborators are obviously still on. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to give more or take more. You see what I mean? It depends on also the value of the input, and so it's a difficult question. But it's something that we do face in different parts of our career.
The question becomes really material when it comes to co-authorship.
Yeah, exactly. That's one.
What counts as a contribution? And in my work, I'm always happy to. I mean, I feel obligated to put, to add co-authors as soon as it seems like they're going to make or have made an intellectual contribution. This is a quote that I learned from Gary King, by the way, right? It's, I think in the beginning, I don't know. What's a contribution, right? To me, a contribution is intellectual. It's not necessarily measured in hours, and often the contribution that a co-author has made to papers of mine made to an outsider look like, oh, gee, they've just spent 1.5 hours on this, and now they're on your paper. And I'm like, no. They spent 1.5 hours on this because they just spent 20 years,
exactly,
by the luck of the draw, thinking about the very question that I needed answered for this paper. So may look easy from the outside, but really they've spent more time than anybody else on the paper. So clearly they should be on it.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a very important point that you're making, that sometimes it looks like, the person just put in, 10 minutes or 15 minutes of a feedback, but it's something they thought about for a very long time. So obviously it will, you have someone who never baked a pizza, it will take them 2 hours. Someone who does it all the time takes them 5 minutes, basically.
That's right. And like this begs an institutional question that we're really struggling with as a discipline right now, namely the question of data sharing. Co-chairing, and the move to become a more transparent empirical research enterprise. There's the question of like, gee, should I make my data available to somebody so they can just take it?
Just take it, exactly.
So I happen to be on the side of the field that thinks that yes, we need to share data. I think I've had my awakening moments, and now we're sharing data when we can legally. But with data, it's just really obvious. With methods, it's perhaps less obvious, right? So people might come and say, "Hey, Adel, could you just sort of quickly set up this multi-level model for me?" And you're like, "Yeah, sure, I could do this real quick," but realize that this is my career.
Yeah.
But this is what I do for a living. So we're talking collaboration here. Alternatively, you could spend the next 2 years yourself and try to figure out how to do
that. I think that's actually a very good question. It's an answer to the question that I just posed, that expertise takes time. Expertise it looks very easy when it's done. I mean, look at the World Cup is being played right now. It looks very easy what they're doing on the pitch, but the amount of training they have put in to make it look that easy, it's just huge. And this brings me to the final question about the macro strategies, and then we go a little bit into the micro and ending. We realize that we are soon at the end of this interview altogether. But thinking about mastery, thinking about collaboration, and say that you have someone listening to this interview, finding themselves perhaps in not the perfect environment to build mastery. They don't necessarily have all the great graduate students around them, the postdocs and so on, but they still strive towards that, and they can collaborate, they can build mastery in different ways. But how do you what's your advice to people sitting in those situations, aspiring towards moving up the ladder of excellence and mastery? How to navigate this question?
Yeah, so I gather you're asking what if somebody finds himself in an institutional environment that's not conducive,
exactly,
fostering
yet the person wants to
face-to-face interaction.
Yeah.
I think the two answers are books and media and conferences.
Mm.
So I can't answer this globally, but when we talk about methods, over the last 2, even more, maybe 3 decades, a real network has been built up of training facilities that's just really impressive. Right? It started with ICPSR at Michigan, which offered these really phenomenal summer courses in different methods. Now there are other summer schools in the United States, in Europe, I'm sure in Asia. There are companies who offer this. There are web series that just do methods trainings. And the reason these trainings, especially ICPSR, were started was the realization that, in order to teach quantitative methods to social scientists, you need somebody who can speak to social scientists. And very few statisticians, mathematicians know how to talk to sociologists, say. And so that network is really fantastic. Then many conferences, thinking about, the political methodology conference, for example, but also the American Sociological Association meeting, the PAA, various conferences have short courses before or after the conference, half a day, 2 days on topics. And, as long as you can attend those, which of course takes resources, that's a really, really great way of doing this.
I see.
Who was that? Somebody, I was just talking to somebody who, impressed me greatly. That's right, a graduate student in an Asian country who said that, they'd been told they needed to use this method. They couldn't read the original papers, so they just sat down and, booked 2 hours of their day to read a textbook that, after a year got them there. I mean, that really impressed me.
That's amazing. So they sat down reading a textbook, like statistics or whatever it was.
It started with linear algebra.
Yeah.
And in order to get to understanding this method, that was just extraordinary.
Yeah, that's really deep. That's really deep commitment. So thinking about the micro part of a scholar, and especially now for you, Felix, in terms of, if we go back, in time and thinking about, your average day, your average week, in terms of how you structure it, when you wake up and what's your, setup in terms of that. Could you walk us through Felix then and Felix now, and just, let us get a glimpse of how you structure your day?
I'm not sure I'm ready to give you deep insights into my own psychopathology. There are times where work works. There are times when work does not work. Some tips that I think are really essential is, first, I found it's really helpful to recognize a tension in sort of the social science culture. On one hand, as I've alluded to before, is we have this great expectation of passion, and almost artistic relationship to our pursuit. And I really love that. I don't have that feeling very often, but when I do have it, it's really wonderful, right? You're on a project and you can't stop working. You're working with people that are deeply inspiring. I'm in that phase right now where I only work with people that are a thrill to work with. That's good, right? So that's the art side. That's the passion. That's great. And I think to an extent, it's really necessary to feel passion for our work, and to recognize that if we don't have that, then we just have a job.
Yeah.
But then there's the other side of me that says, how lucky of those who can pursue their career treating this as a job. What does a job mean? A job means regular hours. You get up when you get up. you're at your desk. I don't know, some people are there at 6:30, and some are there at 8:30.
Yeah.
And then you have the time blocked, the internet's off, and you write or code or whatever you do. I certainly grew up in sort of on the passion side of my training. My undergrad, as an undergrad, I thought, all these professors just pursue their passion. Right, super. But then when I was in graduate school, I met, one of my cohort mates, impressed me beyond measure. And, surprisingly, he's made it big. I'm talking about David Harding at Berkeley, one of, I think, the great sociologists of my generation. He impressed me and some of my colleagues by treating graduate school as a job. He arrived at a predictable hour, he left at a predictable hour, and in between he worked. And it took me a while to get there.
Yeah, it's amazing. So you basically try to mimic a bit of both, right? Get the hours in, like thinking about it as a job, but also get the vocational part, the passion part into it. So getting a structure, but also getting the artistic passion. It's really amazing that you say that, because often we sort of overemphasize this vocational part, which I totally buy into. You need to have the passion in the sense that you really need to develop the passion. You don't need to just have it. You something you develop a taste for a certain idea or certain activity. But you also are structured in a life, right? You have only 24 hours. You still need to get the routine part, which is sort of the job part of the equation.
And then there's the problem, of course, as sociologists, we are and are supposed to be interested in everything. I mean, the old joke goes that I don't know if it's funny to anybody but sociologists, maybe not even them. But
let's go for it. Let's try it.
At parties, because we find everything interesting, and we want to ask sort of serious questions about it. But there is only so much time in the day, and specialization, of course, certainly makes life easier. I have to say, I find that there's actually a generational change. Graduate students now seem to be much more sort of professionally focused than my cohort was 20 years ago. And to an extent, I think that's an enviable state of being. To know one's job, but there's so many styles of doing this right. I'd be the last, I can tell people where I come from. And, it sort of worked for me in the sense that, I'm very happy with the place that I occupy now. But I don't know if what I did actually caused what I did, what I became. I certainly don't know if, even if it did, I don't know if the same advice would still hold 20 years ago. 20 years now later.
Yeah. I mean, this is part of this conversation, is to try to decipher that qualitatively, and then hopefully, if you want to see this as a sort of a scientific question that I think we should at some level, is to try to come up with hypotheses from these conversations to try out as a research project.
That's right. But here again, this is a nice a return to an earlier topic. It's like, so what does the methodologist now say? The first thing the methodologist needs to realize is that this methodologist here is not an expert in work organization. And so I would want to talk to an expert first before I help design that study, because we can't design the study without expert knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really nice link to a previous topic. And so writing is in deep work, Felix, now and before, like, how do you block off time to do actual deep work every day, every week, or is it like, how do you think about the deep work part? And this deep work part could be about writing, could be reading statistics or writing, code or so.
Yeah, no, three things are really essential for me. I need blocked time to get into the flow. I'm unfortunately not one of these people who can sit down and produce prose.
Mm.
I sit there for half an hour reminding myself what I did just the day before, being amazed at how good or how bad what I did the day before was, and remind myself of the argument. Takes a half hour at least. Then I need to start writing. So under 2 hours. So my blocks are 2 hours at least.
2 hours at least. So 1 hour warm up basically, and 1 hour actual production.
The second thing I need conversation. Some people think, well, when they write, and there's aspects where that's true for me. Some people think, well, when they talk, and that's certainly true for me. I discover holes in arguments when I explain them to others. One of the joys of collaboration. I find myself being certain that I know what's going on, and I explain it to my collaborators, and in the process I realize with horror of how poor my thinking was. And then they have ideas, and then they help me and come to new insights. So talking to people. So when I block off time, I block off lots of time for meetings.
For meetings, okay. So approximately how much time would you block off for a meeting? I mean, say that you have an hour, 8-hour day or something like that. Well, how would the blocking look like approximately?
I think I talk to people for about 2 hours a day.
Every day, approximately, roughly. Yeah, with collaborators mainly then, not just, meetings for admin meetings. We're talking like 2 hours research meetings.
Maybe an hour with a collaborator a day.
Yeah.
And then the third thing that I really need is I need walks and bike rides. I need, which sort of is a form of meditation. A place where the internet doesn't beckon, where the unfinished manuscripts aren't just sending me into despair. Where I can just be outside in a very structured, just walking.
Yeah.
And letting the mind wander. And usually that's just good for my health, but occasionally it's the place where I think, finally I get these 2 paragraphs together, or these 3 different strands of arguments. I realize it was really hard to write them at my desk because these are not 3 paragraphs, it's just 2 sentences. I can only do that when I'm outside and walk.
That's great. I love these advice. It's great. So it's basically walking, it's talking, and it's the 2 hour block off for writing and producing new prose. Emailing, where do you put that? Like in the like, do you do that in the evenings? Do you do any emailing before the first thing of the day, or it's an onslaught of emails, obviously, and the more senior you become, the more emails.
That is true. I get maybe 150 a day or so.
Oh my God.
So this is a public service announcement to the young. Delete your email account. Do not block time for email, but I don't have the strength of character. So I have a very senior friend and colleague. When you email him, you'll get an auto response. I check my email on Thursday afternoons between 3 and 5 p.m. or something like that. And I'm in awe of this. Because I have tenure, I could do this, but I don't have the strength of character. Because I usually work in internationally collaborative teams. Yes, the great majority of my current projects are international, with stretching from Taiwan, Hungary, Norway, Denmark, to the West Coast of the US. I have to do a lot of email. And some emails are terrible and some emails are not, but my side of it. But what I've found is that there's certain people to whom, when I write to them, it's really helpful to me. There are people to whom it's not. And it's not so much the individual, it's their role.
Yeah.
I'll give you a specific example. So I find it, so when I work with programmers and data analysts, they're professionals. They're fantastic at what they're doing in ways that I will never reach. But the expectation is that I provide a memo that tells them what to do.
Yeah.
And I find that writing those memos is, without an exception, always extraordinarily clarifying for me. Because out of respect for their expertise, I cannot assume that they share mine.
That's great, yeah.
I cannot assume that they know the subject matter. So I can't use shorthand. They also can't write 20-page documents because they, time literally is money when you're working with a skilled programmer.
Yeah.
Well, you got 5 hours on their clock. So writing a succinct and crystal clear memo. Oh man, I love that.
more of that.
Yeah, which is to say, I find myself, when I write about ideas to colleagues, I'm usually not terribly proud about these emails because I gestured at stuff, and I use shorthand. I appeal to shared understanding, which may be incorrect.
Yeah.
Same with writing to students. Occasionally, I find that I switch into teacher mode. A lecture can only be so long. You have to be succinct. You have to be clear. You have to try different ways of expressing yourself.
Right. Right. And what about? So it sounds like writing down and emailing is not all terrible. It's important still, but it's a way of managing it. What about reading? How much time do you actually get for reading new stuff?
Far too little.
Yeah.
This is one of the great, graduate students. So here's a reason not to graduate. Perhaps the only one is you'll never have as much time again as a graduate student.
Right.
So in a way, I've shackled myself to a commitment to reading because I edit a journal, edit Sociological Methods and Research. And it's a deluge of new manuscripts that, certainly I delegate a lot of this work as one must, with I think maybe 250 new manuscripts a year, but I do read a lot, and that's extremely valuable. And it's equally valuable to read manuscripts that make it into SMR and manuscripts that do not make it into SMR, mostly because they're a better fit for a different journal.
Yeah. Well, that's a great benefit of being an editor as well. You see the field developing in a certain way that others just doesn't see. So it's a valuable position. So Felix, we're really reaching the end here, and this is essentially the last tiny theme, but it's still very important, which is that the ending theme here. And it hits me that you despite your still relatively young age biologically, and you have reached a lot of success in terms of academic measures, and so there are, we'll see around for many years. And my question here is that what are you most proud of today, but what are also things that you are looking forward to achieving here in the future? What are the bigger goals for yourself, but also what are the goals that you would like to see for people listening to this interview?
I don't know about the future, and I think I'm often not a great judge of what's the contribution. I really want to leave it to others to figure out what's useful, and I'm sure that different people will find different things about my work useful for their own pursuits, and many will rightly find it not useful at all. What are the next steps? What would I like to do? Too much. I'm somebody who thinks, perhaps I think in a very American way, less in a European way. I noticed that sort of European professors are expected to have an agenda, and then they have these very narrowly denominated professorships, right? In Europe, you're not a professor of sociology, you're, a professor of sociology with an emphasis on housing and neighborhood effects. And so then they have, get funding for collaborators and postdocs and junior faculty, and they're all tied to this ship. In the US, we don't have that. We have broadly denominated professorships, and we're allowed to change our mind about what we want to do. Both systems produce, great research, and I just happen to be in the American system. So I can tell you some things that I'm really excited about right now. And they're both substantive and statistical. On the substantive side, I'm finding myself getting more and more interested in the production of educational outcomes and educational inequality. And so here I'm fortunate to work with my colleague Tamás Keller at Budapest, and a cast of additional wonderful collaborators running randomized experiments in classrooms, trying to figure out what sorts of feasible, scalable interventions affect both mean achievement and inequality in educational settings, and trying to figure out a way to think about both central tendency and dispersion together in an ethically and instrumentally informative way. That I find really interesting. The methodological side, causal inference moves really quickly, and it has these it's a very broad field that sort of hops from one class of applications to the next. Over the last 15 years, it was mediation analysis. And now there's really exciting work being done on the causal inference, of decomposition questions, which are often tied to questions of where does inequality come from. So, epidemiologists like John Jackson, Tyler Vanderweel have really jumped into that breach. A sociologist like Ian Lundberg have, and my student Agu has some super excellent ideas how to go there. And I'm betting that this is going to be a growth industry, and it's sociologically interesting. So let's do causal inference of disparities.
Well, that's a very highly interesting and growth area in general that I've seen, and also myself interested in deep diving into. But people that are interested in general in these topics, Felix, and this is basically now you'll get the ending action or question, which is that what would you like, people listening to this interview, what would you like them to see more of doing in order to sort of pursue the mastery part or the excellence part or the leadership part, which is jointly obviously closer together? But what would be that challenge?
What should we do? We should ask, is it true? We should do a lot more of that in sociology, and we do it. But what I find really exciting is this new movement of research transparency, reproducibility, and replicability. Is giving us a new set of tools to, help us answer this question, help others answer this question in a yet more rigorous way than we have done before. So I think we want to share more data. We want to share more code. We want to recognize that as scientists, we have to be aggressively modest, and open ourselves in our own work more to criticism and verification by others. And the open science movement is giving us these norms. I mean, they're really old norms, I should say. They're old norms of sort of the classical liberal Popperian approach to intersubjectivity and reproducibility. That's really old. But now they've heightened highlighted these norms in part of the replication crisis. And they're building institutions like secure repositories for data and for code. It helps us to act on these norms. And I think as sociologists, we should really embrace that. And, foster public trust in science, foster our own trust in our findings, and, use all of that as a stepping stone to answer the fundamental, the essential sociological question of, is this actually true?
I think that's a fantastic challenge to invite the audience to think with us about these and pursuing that to always enhance the quality of any pursuit that we're doing, specifically now sociology that we're talking about. Felix Elwert, it was a great pleasure having you on the show. I learned so much, and I'm very convinced that the audience listening to this will be learning as well as I did. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adel.